Hello and welcome back to A Christmas Carol Annotate with me. We are now on stave 4 and we are on the second part of stave 4. So in the previous video, it was quite a short video, but we were presented with an area that was very unfamiliar to Scrooge and would have been very unfamiliar to the Victorian rich. So if you go back to that video and have a look at what we discussed with that, it is quite important to understand where the characters that we meet in this particular area of stave 4 come from, and it's really important that we do understand where they come from so that we can understand why they behave in the way they do. Okay, so let's continue to read. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man, just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh. So, obviously, Dickens hasn't mentioned their names yet, but there are three characters that meet at Old Joe's place to sell him Scrooge's possessions. So we can assume that Old Joe's place is a shop. It could even be a pawnbroker's to sell him Scrooge's possessions now that Scrooge has died. So the description of Joe is fitting of such a morbid procedure, and Joe himself declares that he is older than anyone there. In a moment we'll see when he declares that. So Scrooge, it's important to know that Scrooge doesn't know that this is him, that they're going to be speaking about. So the Ghost of Christmas Future will be showing Scrooge's future if he doesn't change. "Let the charwoman alone to be the first," cried she, who had entered first. So a charwoman is a woman employed to clean someone's house or offices. "Let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance, if we haven't all three met here without meaning it." "You couldn't have met in a better place," said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth. "Come into the parlour. You were made free of it long ago, you know, and the other two aren't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. Ah, how it squeaks! There aren't such a rusty bit of metal in the place as its own hinges, I believe, and I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine." So this is where he's saying there's nobody older in this place than him. "Ha, ha! We're all suitable to our calling. We're well matched. Come into the parlour. Come into the parlour." The parlour was the space behind the screen of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stair-rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle on the floor, and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees, and looking with a bold defiance at the other two. "What odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dilber?" said the woman. "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." So when the charwoman throws Scrooge's possessions on the floor, it seems that she receives a disapproving look from Mrs. Dilber, the laundress, as she has to explain herself. She justifies her lack of respect by pointing out that Scrooge only cared for himself when he was alive, so she's free to do the same. "That's true indeed," said the laundress. "No man more so. Why then, don't stand staring as if you was afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber and the man together. "We should hope not." "Very well, then," cried the woman. "That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber, laughing. "If he wanted to keep 'em after he was dead, a wicked old screw," pursued the woman, "why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there, alone by himself." So the charwoman clarifies her point about it being fair to take Scrooge's possessions. She says that if he had been humane in life, he would have been respected when he died. So Scrooge is being shown the importance of his redemption. Currently, so the need for change. Redemption means the need to change for the better. Currently, He is on the same path of universal damnation as Marley was, who we know died alone as well. It's the truest word ever was spoke, said Mrs. Dilber. It's a judgment on him. So this word judgment keeps coming up throughout this passage that we're going to be looking at today. So we'll be discussing what's meant by this judgment in a moment. I wish it was a little heavier judgment, replied the woman, and it should have been. You may depend upon it. If I could have laid my hands on anything else, open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We know pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met here, I believe. It's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe. So the charwoman says it's no sin to root through Scrooge's things and sell them on because Scrooge was so miserly. She's not afraid of any higher judgment, so any judgment from God, for benefiting from his death. Perhaps the interaction between the three scroungers and old Joe could represent an earthly judgment on Scrooge. In the novella, the fear of death is linked to the anticipation of moral reckoning and the inevitable dispensation of punishment and reward that follows death in heaven or hell. In this passage, Scrooge sees the judgment of his fellow man. So there's an implication here that Dickens is saying that it's just as important it's just as important a judgment that you get from the people who you've been surrounded by, the people who you've been around, and that judgment often reflects the type of judgment that God would have on you. Obviously, this would be particularly impactful for a Victorian audience who would have been predominantly religious and would have believed in a heaven and a hell. So it's really, really impactful here to see that judgment doesn't just come from God. Judgment actually God stems his judgment from the way other people are treated and other people's treatment on earth. But the gallantry of her friends would not allow of this, and the man in faded black, mounting the breach first, produced his plunder. It was not extensive, a seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severally examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sum he was disposed to give for each upon the wall, and added them up into a total when he found there was nothing more to come. That's your account, said Joe, and I wouldn't give another sixpence if I was to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next? Mrs. Dilber was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner. So these are a list of things that Mrs. Dilber has collected, the laundress has collected at Scrooge's place, which shows he doesn't own much at all. It also shows how he really, really didn't take care of himself very much with his wealth either. So it's not just about the fact that he didn't take care of anybody else. He didn't take care of himself, so he denied himself, luxuries. He denied himself happiness. He denied himself all the comforts that he could have bought. So by being around people, but also just materialistic things as well. So let's write this in here. I always give too much to ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I ruin myself, said old Joe. That's your account. If you asked me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock off half a crown. And now undo my bundle, Joe, said the first woman. Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. What do you call this? Said Joe. Bed curtains. Ah, returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on her crossed arm. Bed curtains. You don't mean to say you took 'em down, rings and all, with him lying there, said Joe. Yes, I do, replied the woman. Why not? So we see Mrs. Dilber is perhaps the most ruthless of the three. She strips Scrooge's bed as his dead body is lying there. Again, later on, she justifies this callous action with the reminder that this is Scrooge that they're talking about, so it doesn't matter. You were born to make your fortune, said Joe, and you'll certainly do it. I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can get anything in it by reaching it out for the sake of such a man as he was. I promise you, Joe, returned the woman coolly. Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now. His blankets? Asked Joe. Whose else's, do you think? Replied the woman. He isn't likely to take cold without 'em, I dare say. I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh? Said old Joe, stopping in his work and looking up. Don't be afraid of that, returned the woman. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things, if he did. Ah, you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one too. They'd have wasted it, if it hadn't been for me. What do you call wasting of it? Asked old Joe. Putting it on him to be buried in, to be sure, replied the woman with a laugh. Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. So she takes the good shirt off his dead body, another mark of disrespect and emphasis of Mrs. Dilber's mercenary, so greedy, nature. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it isn't good enough for anything. It's quite as becoming to the body. He can't look uglier than he did in that one. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. As they sat grouped about their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp, he viewed them with a detestation and disgust which could hardly have been greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. Ha ha! Laughed the same woman, when old Joe, producing a flannel bag with money in it, told out their several gains upon the ground. This is the end of it, you see. He frightened every one away from him when he was alive to profit us when he was dead. Ha ha ha. So Mrs. Dilber condemns Scrooge here, commenting that the taking of his property is his earthly retribution. So retribution means like revenge or payback. So when she says to profit us when he was dead. Spirit, said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot. I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this? So Scrooge is starting to realise that the body he's looking at could represent his future, but he still hasn't realised that he's being shown his own actual future, as it will happen if he doesn't change. Scrooge's outburst of merciful heaven is Dickens increasing the sense of Scrooge fearing damnation and emphasising the importance of redemption, so the importance of needing to change himself for the better. He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed. So the uncurtained bed is important for readers, as we know Mrs. Dilber has taken the curtains from Scrooge's bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay a something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced round it in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light rising in the outer air fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. The list of adjectives to describe Scrooge is that of a condemned, so doomed or fated man, much like Marley was when he died. This is actually a really, really good quotation to remember. There's so much to unpack here, so much to say about it. I'd really like it if you could pop a comment in the comment section and let me know how you'd analyse this, what you'd say if you were to analyse this. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. So he really wanted to uncover the face, to see whose face it was. Obviously he probably knows whose face it was, but he just didn't have the power, the strength to do it, which shows obviously how scared he feels about it. O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast at thy command, for this is thy dominion. This reflection reasserts the fear of judgment. The rest of this paragraph suggests that death can't change a person's fated afterlife, so people write their own afterlife in their life, hence Marley's damnation. The style of language here is the type of language you'd usually associate with a church sermon, so almost like Dickens is lecturing Scrooge on the consequences of his miserly life. Or perhaps it's a message from God, so it depends how you want to interpret it. Let me know what you think in the comments as well. But of the loved, revered, and honoured head, thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes, or make one feature odious. It is not that the hand is heavy, and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous and true, the heart brave, warm and tender, and the pulse a man's. Strike, shadows, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound, to sow the world with life immortal. No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked upon the bed. So Scrooge, hearing these thoughts about death, could represent that he is realizing this for himself, or we could interpret that this is a message from God or from the ghost. So perhaps it's God speaking to him, perhaps it's the ghost speaking to him. We're not sure, but there's lots to unpack there and lots to interpret there as well about whose voice it is that he could hear. He thought, if this man could be raised up now, what would be his foremost thoughts? Avarice. So avarice means greed. Hard dealing, griping cares. They have brought him to a rich end, truly. So Scrooge assumes that this person who has been abandoned would be consumed by thoughts of avarice, so greed or materialism. So he sees himself in the man. The image of the empty room is another image of Scrooge's bleak future. He lay in the dark, empty house, with not a man, a woman, or a child to say that he was kind to me in this or that, and for the memory of one kind word I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think. So we'll leave it here today. We will continue on with stave 4 in the next video. So this is the revision booklet. This is the revision booklet where we collate all of the key quotations in, and we've done it for all of the staves so far. So if you haven't watched the videos for the previous staves, then I suggest that you do that, please. I'd highly encourage that. A link for this revision booklet is in the description box below if you haven't printed it off already. So these are the quotations that we've collected from the passage that we've read today. So you might want to pause the video here so that you can record them. I'm just going to zoom in a tiny bit so that we can see the bottom part where the contextual information is. So this contextual information needs to go in the scroll section of your booklet as well. So you might want to pause it here so that you can write this down. The contextual information: the mercenary nature of the charwoman, Mrs. Dilber, and Old Joe may be unsettling to watch for Scrooge and the Victorian rich, but they serve an integral purpose. They are poor, so Mrs. Dilber, the charwoman, Old Joe are poor and have no other means of making money. Whilst their way of making money is dislikable, let's change this here, dislikable or, unpleasant to watch, it shows their desperation in a society that doesn't help them. In a lot of ways, they are similar to ignorance and want. Their callousness is as a result of the lack of social responsibility prevalent in the 19th century. So earlier we obviously met ignorance and want, and we spoke about how a few quotations, a few juxtaposing images that are used. One particular one is about how angels would have been devils lurked, so they should have been angelic, these children, but they had no choice but to become devilish. So in a similar way, these characters, the charwoman, Mrs. Dilber, and Old Joe, it's almost like they don't have a choice but to be this heartless, to be this greedy, because they have no other means of making money in such a desperate situation. Okay, thank you so much for joining me today. If you are finding our videos useful, then please remember to comment, like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you. Bye.